I'd like to start off by welcoming you to today's webinar. This is a BIAKelsey sponsored webinars with our partners at Dialog Text, entitled Call Analytics for Mobile Marketing, Real Strategies, Real Stories. So like I said, as we're waiting for people to come in, I just have a few housekeeping items I'd like to go through with you guys real quickly. I'd like to start off by letting everybody know that we are recording today's webinar, so all registered attendees will be receiving an email from us with links to both the on-demand webinar and a PDF of the slide deck, so keep an eye out for that. Also, we'd like to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout today's webinar, so if any time you have a question you'd like to ask, you can do it either two ways. You can either do it the usual way and type in your question in the little questions box in your GoToWebinar panel, or since we are live tweeting throughout today's webinar, you can use the hashtag #CallAnalytics and tweet your questions to us, and we'll be monitoring those. And if you experience any technical difficulties through today's webinar, please email us at webinars@biakelsey.com. We have staff that are standing by that can assist you. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to our moderator for today's webinar, the Chief Analyst and VP of Content for BIAKelsey, Mike Boland. Mike, take it away.
Thanks, Patrick. So as Patrick mentioned, I'm Mike Boland. I'm an analyst with BIAKelsey. So welcome everyone to Call Analytics for Mobile Marketing, Real Strategies, Real Stories. As that title implies, our goal is really to talk in more concrete terms about what the call analytics opportunity is and what are its best practices, including real-life case studies. So to help me do that, I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Steve Griffiths, who's SVP of Marketing, Strategy, and Analytics at Dialog Text. Steve, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Sure. So we'll also get into a deeper introduction of you and Dialog Tech in a minute. But first, a few notes about what we're trying to accomplish today and what everyone can expect out of the next 45 minutes or so. So like I said, the word of the day is concrete. We're going to go through some of the quickly evolving data sets that really paint the picture for the call analytics opportunity, including some brand new BIAKelsey data that will make its grand debut today. So no other audience has seen this data yet. And then we're going to hear from Steve about Dialog Tech as really a living, breathing proof of some of these concepts and again, the case studies that represent the best practices and actionable takeaways from the real companies that are applying call analytics to drive revenue. So before we get into all of that, if we go to the next slide, I'd like to establish some context and credibility here at the front end with a few words about BIAKelsey. So for those of you unfamiliar, we're an independent market research and analyst firm that focuses on media and advertising. So we put together insights and analysis, and that takes form in lots of ways, including research reports and market forecasts and consulting and conferences and webcasts like this. So this slide spells out lots of the ways that takes form. And what you also see here is a screenshot of a white paper I did last year on call monetization and call analytics. And I'm currently working on a refresh of that analysis, some of which we'll see today. So if we go to the next slide, likewise, for the sake of context, Steve, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and Dialog Tech?
Sure. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'm pleased to be here and speaking with you all today. Dialog Tech is the combination of two businesses, If by Phone and Mongoose Metrics, which is another provider in the call analytics space that If by Phone acquired late last year. And in March of this year, we rebranded our company as Dialog Tech. And our combined entity is focused on really doing one thing. It's helping marketers understand the role that phone calls play in their marketing campaigns in today's mobile-first world. So we offer a platform for enterprise marketers as well as agencies to really understand how their initiatives are generating calls, how to personalize those call experiences for their prospects and customers, and how to really understand what happened on those phone calls so they can just do a better job as marketers. So we serve a wide range of clients from small, fast-growing companies all the way through the Fortune 50. We have about 5,000 customers today across a variety of industries. And in terms of me personally, I'm in charge of our marketing group here at Dialog Tech, as well as our strategy and analytics group. So a lot of what we do is think about where our market's heading and try to share insights that we see from the research that we conduct and the analysis of our customer base to help marketers do a better job at their job.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. So if we go to the next slide, here's our agenda. We're going to be going through all these topics between Steve and me. And the best place to start is to talk about the factors and the trends that are driving the call analytics opportunity. And the underlying driver for a lot of the things we're going to be going over today is mobile and usage trends and how that's all driving call volume. So if we go to the next slide, a few data points here. Currently, smartphone penetration in the U.S. is about 72% and quickly growing. The majority of searches are happening on mobile devices, and the majority of digital ad spend will catch up with that reality according to our projections by 2019 and target smartphones in various ways. And that all really leads to higher call volume, simply because mobile usage correlates with phone calls, as we'll demonstrate today. The smartphone bolts a search and discover device with a phone. And not only are calls resulting from that, but they're very much high value, high intent calls from transaction ready consumers. And then lastly, there's a much deeper and scientific angle that isn't normally discussed around this topic, which is that humans really have a biological imperative and a drive to communicate by voice. And that applies to most human interactions, including commerce. Despite the automation and e-commerce of the digital era, the complexities of many transactions still require voice communications and talking to another human. And that really isn't going away anytime soon, even in a highly digital world. So if we go to the next slide, to kind of unpack that a little bit further, this is a concept that Dialog Tech CEO Irv Shapiro really likes to talk about, and he first opened my eyes to it when I was writing an article on this topic a few months ago. And here's what he said at that time, which always stuck with me. Because something like life insurance is a complex purchase, consumers don't want to fill out a form, they want to call a number. An even better example is home health care. If you're going to find someone to help watch mom, you're talking to them. You're not doing that over the web. And that's just really a few examples and use cases, but it really applies to lots of product categories, and especially those that have complexity and therefore tend to be higher consideration purchases with greater value and margins. So the entire call analytics opportunity we're going to go over today is really underscored by the fact that it's usually optimizing revenue around these kind of high value categories like autos and financial services and other things we're going to demonstrate today. So if we go to the next slide, further in support of Irv's premise is a stat that I usually like to give in other contexts, but I think it equally applies here. And the magic number is 7. So 7 is the percentage of U.S. retail spending that happens online. So the rest, the vast majority, all happens offline in physical stores or other kind of non-e-commerce contexts. And it often happens in a very dialogue-rich conversion funnel. But more important than that, if we go to the next slide, is that the 93% happening offline is influenced through digital channels. For example, mobile-influenced offline commerce is about $1 trillion in the U.S., and a lot of that is driven by phone calls, where shoppers are qualifying purchase decisions in different ways. So if we go to the next slide, what this all leads up to is call analytics. These calls are happening due to all the factors we just went over, so call analytics really is the engine to squeeze more volume and value out of those calls. So, what is call analytics? I think many of you are familiar with it, so I'll go through this slide pretty quickly. One common form it takes is mobile search and pay per call, which includes things like call extensions, which Steve will go over in a bit. But it's not just driving calls, but also optimizing campaigns by better tracking and analyzing them. So what was said on the call? How long did it last? Did a conversion result? If so, can that be tied back or attributed to the campaign from which that call resulted? And if so, how can that data be used to optimize campaign effectiveness on an ongoing basis? There's also areas to the field of call analytics such as contextual routing. So to optimize inbound phone leads by making sure they get to the right sales rep, which can be a function of things like their call history or the search keywords from which that call resulted. So there's a lot of interesting science that's developing around all of this. And if we go to the next slide, it's also important to note that it's not just search. You know, call analytics is often thought of in the context of search, and that is where a lot of it's happening, but the opportunity really lives in many places, and that includes the growing number of places that phone numbers are showing up in mobile channels. So that includes display ads, which are getting increasingly dynamic with actionable buttons like call links. It can include landing pages such as your website or directory apps like YP and Yelp and Foursquare and others. And it also includes social apps, which is actually the fastest growing category driving calls to businesses. So I want to spend a little bit of time drilling down on that. If we go to the next slide, as background, you know, we're seeing lots of ways that social media is trying to monetize natively. And that increasingly includes in-feed ad units like Facebook newsfeed ads, for example. So that's really nothing new, but what is new is that these native ad units are increasingly getting actionable with buttons to engage with a business. So Twitter, for example, has experimented with click-to-call buttons that give advertisers tools to let their customers call them directly from promoted tweets, which is their native ad unit. Facebook recently integrated call buttons within newsfeed ads as part of its local awareness ads program. And that's what you see here on this screen with the kind of animated GIF on the right. And we're seeing others like Pinterest and Instagram integrate buy buttons for m-commerce, but you know, I believe the next step, for a lot of those players is going to be call buttons that again tap into that much larger offline commerce opportunity. So we go to the next slide. This leads to my final chapter before I hand it over to Steve, which is to discuss some of the call volume and conversion data we're seeing as a result of all of the trends I just outlined. If we go to the next slide, we can dive into our fresh call volume forecast data. So this was the data I mentioned earlier, and you're the first live audience to see this data. Previously, we measured call volume resulting from mobile search, but because this is really expanding to so many other mobile content formats, like social, as I just went over, it really compelled us to start to segment this out a bit more. So the top line finding is that calls driven to businesses from all mobile content formats are about 93 billion this year, growing to about 160 billion by 2019, and that includes both mobile app and mobile web. But importantly, you know, how does that segment between different formats? It's interesting. These formats are each kind of trending in similar ways as our overall mobile ad revenue forecast, which is not shown here, but it's similarly based on mobile usage patterns and the values assigned to different ad formats that are emerging in each of these categories. So, for example, search is the clear winner here in terms of call volume, and that's really a function of its intent-based nature, which tends to drive a lot of calls, and also the intuitive handoff from search to call that's being driven by lots of tools like call extensions, which Steve will discuss. But another notable finding here is that social media is the smallest but fastest growing format from which calls are generated. And that simply goes back to some of the stuff I mentioned in the previous slide. But another thing to note here is that social is taking a bite out of traditional display. So as you can see here, display is showing relatively flat growth. And again, that's reflective of some of the broader mobile usage trends we're seeing out there where, you know, traditional display is being displaced by lots of other categories that are more cleverly integrated into mobile experiences like native social, for example. And then lastly, landing pages are also interesting because of the work that Google is doing to compel the world to optimize mobile web pages better. And that overall effort is really going to result in a more kind of cleaned up mobile web including optimized pages where people can find things faster, including calls to actions like phone numbers and call buttons. And we believe the traffic going to mobile landing pages is going to increase from all of that, and in a lot of cases driven from things like search, starting in a search, going to a landing page, and then launching a call. But this also includes apps like listings and profiles in places like Yelp, and that's important to note that those are counted in these findings. So if we go to the next slide, so there's still kind of a looming reality check here. So in addition to the high value, high intent customer calls, a lot of businesses are also getting flooded with what we like to call junk calls. So these are things like missed dials or robocalls or solicitations, and even in some cases purpose-driven calls from customers that might be of lower value than a new business lead. So specifically, our data indicate that only 19% of inbound calls to businesses are quality leads. And this is happening more and more. There's an interesting kind of dynamic over the last decade that a lot of people don't know about, where more individuals are carrying mobile phones, with unlisted numbers. We know that. And do not call legislation has started to clamp down on marketers. So the result of those two things is that telemarketers have had to resort to calling businesses instead of individuals. So the volume of those calls to businesses has skyrocketed. So given that reality, it really just further compels the need for better analytics and lead scoring and conversion tracking to essentially separate the good calls from the bad. So if we go to the next slide, that's really kind of a good segue for Steve. So with that kind of backdrop, Steve's going to layer on some more supporting data that Dialog Tech is seeing from their work, and then also tee up a brand new product announcement they have, as well as some case studies, as I alluded to earlier, that demonstrate best practices and tangible takeaways for anyone interested in call analytics. So Steve, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. So if we jump to the next slide, Mike's shared a lot of great data already on the secular shift to mobile and the role that plays in driving phone calls. So I don't want to bombard you with even more stats, but one of the things that I find very interesting is we've all been talking about mobile for a long time, but even a few short years ago, when you looked at the data, it was really marketers were dipping in their toe. Everybody knew mobile was going to be the next big thing, but the data didn't say it was here yet. What I find interesting is that has changed. This year or next year, the majority of digital ad spend will target mobile. And we're already seeing continuing growth rates on big numbers. We're no longer talking about a small base that's growing very quickly. We're talking about rapid growth on a very big chunk of the dollars being invested into digital advertising. So it is a mobile-first world today. And if we go to the next slide, there's a couple of data points that we found from analyzing our own customer data that we thought were interesting. So what we did is we looked at a representative sample of our customers. We looked at about 60 million website sessions from November of 2014 through May of this year, which resulted in approximately 400,000 phone calls. And we found two really interesting observations. The first is that calls from mobile in that 6-month stretch within our customer base had increased 33% in 6 months alone. If you annualize that, that's 77% growth in a year. So rapidly increasing number of calls coming from mobile. We also saw that the typical conversion over the phone for mobile sessions, mobile engagement, was about 2%. So depending on the product or the industry or the use case, a sort of standard web form conversion could be in a range, but tends to be around 4% for paid search. So about 4% of your visitors to your landing pages will convert via a via a form. An additional 2% will call. So what that means as a marketer is my conversion rate, it's actually 50% higher than I've been led to believe because I'm missing the impact of phone calls. It's essentially a third of my conversions I'm missing. I don't understand where those conversions are coming from, so I can't manage them, I can't optimize them, which has lots of implications for attribution and measuring ROI. And as we can see, that number is getting bigger and bigger by the day. So if we jump to the next slide, I want to talk you through just a few different solutions that are available to you to help address these issues. And as Mike noted earlier, we are excited to announce today a new product, which is Dialog Text for mobile marketing, which is designed for marketers and for agencies to manage and optimize their mobile marketing initiatives. So the solution works for any mobile channel, whether it's search or social or display, and in a moment we'll talk about some interesting features for Google call extensions, the call button on the search engine results page. So if we jump to the next slide, I'll talk you through essentially 3 different components of tools or strategies that you can use to address the opportunity here. The first is around attribution. So really essentially getting credit and understanding the conversions that your marketing is generating over the phone. And the way that this works is simply inserting unique trackable phone numbers into your marketing materials. We'll do this dynamically. So think about it as a sophisticated find and replace, if you will, where a static phone number that may be on your website today, we will replace with a dynamically generated one. So in the event of a phone call, we can attribute it back to that visitor, and we can pull through a variety of data associated with that phone call, such as the referring source, the campaign, pages they visited before they called, pages they visited after they called, etc. So now, when you've got that conversion data, you've got a better, more accurate view of the total leads that you're generating and the ROI of your campaign. So if we go to the next slide, what I just talked through there was really for your owned digital assets, things that drive visitors to one of your landing pages. What part of our announcement today is new features for Google call extensions. So as I mentioned, this is when someone conducts a search in Google and they're presented with a mobile ad, you'll frequently see call extensions, which could be a button to visit the website, could be a button to get directions, could be a button to call. So what our solution does is it automatically populates those call buttons with unique trackable phone numbers so that when they are clicked and that conversion is associated with AdWords, we're able to retrieve all of that data from AdWords and pull it into our platform to give you that complete, accurate attribution data. And part of the value of our solution is the workflow tools to make it really easy to manage a campaign of any size, any number of ad groups, any number of keywords to automatically populate and manage those phone numbers all from one place, all with a single sign-on interface that links directly into AdWords. So for any marketer that's doing call extensions at scale, any size campaign, it really takes a lot of the time and the pain out of managing that process while providing a whole lot of rich data on which keywords are actually driving phone calls from Google call extensions. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is just a quick overview of how it works. It takes a matter of minutes to configure. As I mentioned, we have a native API integration with AdWords, so we just validate the linkage with your AdWords account within our platform, and then we have a self-service user interface to configure your different ad groups within AdWords, and then we immediately begin collecting data and generating a series of reports that show for callers the keyword that drove them to call, as well as aggregate reporting that show you which of your campaigns, which of your ad groups, which of your keywords are generating phone calls. And like our other solutions, we will then take all of this information and push it out to other platforms such as a CRM or a bid management solution if you're using one to optimize your search campaigns. Next slide, please. So we talked about the first category, which is attribution. The second category is personalization. So we're able to collect a ton of information about a caller. Things they did before they called, pulling in first-party information from your CRM, pulling in third-party information from other databases. We can create very rich profiles of callers. So it doesn't make sense to just send that phone call to the main number. We should use all of that data to make an intelligent routing decision, because the data shows if you get a phone call to the right person in your organization, the person best equipped to handle that customer's needs, whether it be industry expertise or domain knowledge, whether it be geography-based, whether it be the time of day that they called, whatever the needs of your business, getting that person to the right agent within your organization increases the odds of turning that caller into revenue. So we call that personalization, and that's a big piece of what we do. Next slide, please. The third component is disposition. So now that you understand where your calls are coming from, and now that you understand where in your organization to get those calls, you want to know what actually happened on the call. Was a sale made? Was an appointment set? Did nothing happen at all, which is also valuable information for marketers. So the third solution area is around analyzing what actually happened on the call. And you can do that by recording, transcribing, and then analyzing every single phone call. And part of Dialog Text solutions allows our customers to search for the keywords and the phrases, the specific language that was said on the call, whether it be by the person that called in, the customer, or the agent, to really understand, was that a good call or was that a bad call? You know, Mike spoke to the data earlier on, which showed that only 19% of phone calls are actually true sales-ready leads. So how do you sort of separate the wheat from the chaff and dial in and understand what's happening on those good calls and which of your calls are actually worth investigating further? So there are tools that you can use to do that. Next slide, please. So all of these are part of our suite of applications that we offer, and I won't go into each of these in detail, but if there are questions on the specific features or functionality of our platform, I'm happy to address those during the Q&A. So with that, let's keep moving forward, and what we'd like to do next slide please, is to talk about some case studies, some real life examples of customers that have used this technology and some of the results that they're seeing. So the first is a case study from a hotel and resort chain called Hotels Corp. And as Mike alluded to earlier, there are certain categories of products and services that lend themselves to phone calls more than others. And we typically refer to these as considered purchases, things where your research no doubt will start online, but then there comes a point in that sales and marketing process where you want to talk to someone else, to ask questions, to get confirmation, to have a real-time, more efficient back and forth to understand what it is that you'd be purchasing before you pull the trigger. So a lot of the industries that we see in our customer base are things like insurance and financial services, automotive, healthcare, for-profit education, things like that where, again, it's going to be critical to engage in dialogue with someone before completing a purchase. And the travel industry is another great example of a considered purchase. So in the case of Hotels Corp, what we saw was first, they started using the attribution components of our platform to really understand which of their campaigns were driving calls, and to get that full picture so they had attribution for all of those calls. They integrated that data into Google Universal Analytics and into AdWords, so they had that full view of calls next to their clicks, and started optimizing. Started using that information to make bidding decisions, to make campaign decisions, and in their instance, what they saw was an increase in phone leads of 83%, and an increase in bookings or reservations of 71%. And they did it by actually taking cost out of the equation as well. They decreased their cost per conversion by 10%. Another interesting thing that Hotels Corp did was they utilized call recordings and call analytics to try to understand what was happening on their calls. So they did something interesting where they specifically were interested in if there was a call that was under 3 minutes. Why? Was it a marketing campaign that was misleading to the caller? Was the agent not following approved scripts? What was it? Was it something in the IVR, the series of automated questions that they asked callers before they got to a live agent? So they were able to use that data to continue to optimize and generate even more phone leads. So there's the first case study. If we jump to the next slide, please. The next example is a very large Fortune 50 insurance company. And again, insurance is one of those examples of a complex, sophisticated sale that doesn't typically happen exclusively online, especially when you look at life insurance or supplemental life insurance. Chances are you're going to want to actually speak with an agent to really understand the policy and the levels and the other aspects of the service before making the purchase. So again, this is a great example of where a large entity was able to increase their phone leads up 14% in 4 months alone. So saw really great results. And when we look at our own customer data, it's interesting to see that financial services and insurance, the average call length for that industry is 8.5 minutes, which is actually 63% higher than the average across all of our customers. So again, just really underscores the need that the customer had to understand that dynamic and what was happening on their phone calls. If we jump to the next slide, this is an example of a digital agency, Blue Fountain Media, that was working with a client that sold and provided self-storage units. And in their data, they found that customers were 2 times more likely to call versus purchase online. Double the propensity to pick up the phone than to complete an e-commerce transaction. So they came to us really wanting to understand the specific campaigns that were driving that. And using our data, they were able to discover that 76% of all of the calls from their website were being driven by paid search. Now, as the agency that's managing paid search on behalf of a client, isn't that a really interesting data point to know and to be able to share with your client that their work was responsible for over 3/4 of the phone calls driven from the website. So in their case, they also saw really great results. They were able to actually decrease their cost per conversion by 43% by weeding out keywords that weren't generating phone calls and doubling down on the keywords that were generating phone calls, which in many instances were different than the keywords that were generating form conversions. So optimization on that side and overall increased, since they were able to redeploy a lot of those dollars, increased the overall call volume by 58%. So net, no change in the dollars that they invested, but a real return in terms of lead flow and cost per lead. And then last but not least is another example of a digital agency. This one is called SquareOne, and a client that they were working with, which was a global HVAC manufacturer, the exciting, glamorous industry of HVAC. But again, another example of something that you're not going to drop in an e-commerce shopping cart to complete a purchase. It's something you're going to want to talk to somebody. So they were engaged. They engaged SquareOne to help them to drive phone leads to all of their local dealers across the U.S. for paid search. And SquareOne was using a partner of ours called Kenshu in the bid management space to track their paid search efforts and to do optimizations around the keywords that they were bidding on. And so what they did was, again, allocate budget to the keywords that were actually driving phone calls, cutting out the ones that didn't. And they introduced a call scoring mechanism where they were able to put an IVR ahead of their in the call flow to really weed out non-sales calls. So the 81%, if you will, that isn't sales ready, they were able to take that out and really only channel the qualified calls to their closest dealer using our what we call our store locator functionality, where you automatically route calls to the closest location within the dealer network. So in their instance, they saw phone leads increase by 70%, and the cost of those leads decreased by 65% in just 5 months. Next slide, please. So those are really it for our case studies. Happy to dig in deeper on the Q&A, but for now I'll turn it back over to Mike to wrap up what it means for the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you for that. Really illustrative. I like that. What can be done with call analytics, and some of the things it reveals in terms of course correcting and optimizing different types of campaigns that drive calls. So thanks for that. So we're going to soon go into questions, and I'll remind you all at this point, before I go into this last chapter, to write your questions in the section of the GoToMeeting dashboard, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. I already see a number of them rolling in here. So first, a few slides, yes, about how this applies to you, and this is really in light of some of the interesting trends in technology that I'm tracking, which are really empowering people in marketing roles to implement a lot of the technologies and a lot of the things that Steve just went over. So I'm going to go over two interrelated trends here, and these have a lot to do with organizational dynamics and the evolving ways that software is being bought and sold. So the first trend is that marketing departments are becoming more self-sufficient and less reliant upon IT departments for purchasing and managing software platforms. And this is great because, in the past, being under the jurisdiction of the IT department has really been a barrier to adoption in lots of different kind of marketing technologies. So this trend really becomes very empowering for anyone in a marketing role to be more effective and to budget and to implement many of the things we're talking about today. And really that goes back to a quote that many of you may have heard, which is that by 2017, CMOs will spend more on IT than their counterpart CIOs. And that really serves to further frame this overall opportunity, and that not only do all these great tools exist, but the ability for marketers to actually implement them will continue to be empowered with, both political capital within organizations and then also budget. So the second trend, if you go to the next slide, really works towards that same end with the evolution and dynamics of the software world, and specifically the lowered barriers to robust platform integration. So, for example, the rise of cloud-based software platforms and SaaS service models really allow marketers to manage and run platforms without the requirement for lots of technical knowledge and capital investment and on-site servers. So trend one is more kind of political and budgetary, and trend two is more technical, but the collective result is that there's a lot more empowerment out there for marketers to do the things we're talking about today. So really the moral of the story is for any marketers that are listening, if you haven't already felt some of these benefits, these are just two trends that could really improve your ability to have a real near-term impact with several flavors of marketing technology, but especially what we're going over today, which is call analytics. So really just kind of a macro factor to cap things off here and how this might apply to you. So what we're going to do now, if we go to the next slide, is go into Q&A. And there are a lot that have come in here, and I have a few questions of my own. So let's get right into these. So the first question looks like it's for you, Steve, and it says, I use local paid search to drive phone calls to clients. I often struggle to prove to clients which calls are high quality. What do you recommend to help judge call quality?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's a few ways to do that. First, a very simple way is call recordings, to record and listen to your calls, and get a better sense of which ones are quality and which ones aren't. And some of the technology that I mentioned earlier, which we often call keyword spotting, helps make that process a lot more efficient. So you can seek out specific keywords and phrases that are suggestive of conversion, whether those are appointments or sales or whatever is relevant for your business. So those are two ways. Another way is just using the metadata associated with the calls, looking at things like, were they repeat callers or first-time callers, how long, what was the duration of the call, things of that nature to get a better sense of call quality. So those are a few different ways. And another way would also be if you're using a CRM system to integrate that data into your CRM, so you could be able to determine, so here a call came in, did it turn into a lead, did it turn into an opportunity, did it turn into revenue, and track it through the funnel, so that you could also get a better sense of which ones are quality.
That's great. So here's a question, Steve, that gets to kind of a hot topic today in the marketing world, and one in which you went over, which is attribution, and particularly kind of cross-screen or cross-platform attribution. So the question reads, what happens if a lead visits my paid search landing page, then browses to my main site before calling me from a different web page? Can you still track that call back to the right keyword search and the ad from which it kind of originated?
Right. So the answer is yes. So if a visitor comes to your site from a referring source, whether it's paid search or social media or a display ad, and then navigates through your site to different, from the landing page to different areas, we will be able to still track that. And in fact, we'll give you a bunch of data on that session experience. So here's where they came in, here's the pages they viewed, here's the page they were on when they called, here's where they went after they called. So we'll kind of help you stitch together that click stream data, which can be really insightful when you're thinking about structuring your website and your landing page experiences. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if they don't come to your website, if they're just on the search results page for Google and they just hit that call button, then that too can also be tracked.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually relates to the next question here. I'm doing my best to kind of lump these thematically, but someone's asking, and this goes back to some of the data, so I'll take a swing at this question first and then let you jump in, Steve. But this question's asking, wouldn't landing page calls mainly result from paid searches? Patrick, if you have the ability to jump to slide 16, which is that data set, this also speaks to the question you just answered, Steve. So when looking at the different kind of places that calls are launched from, we delineated in those data sets, landing pages, and then there's also search and things. So this really measures the exact place where that call button is being pushed. So, for example, in search, it's from the search results. In landing pages, it's on that landing pages. Now that landing page visit might have been driven from search, but it's measured under landing pages. So what that really says is that the impact of search is actually greater than what is just indicated on that green line, because it's also driving traffic towards landing pages where calls then happen. And this overall kind of discussion also kind of compels the need for the attribution you just mentioned, Steve, because people are bouncing around a lot, and to be able to see not just where the call resulted, but 1 or 2 or even 3 steps before that from where that kind of lead originated is one of the kind of points of the holy grail of kind of attribution. So just to clarify the data there. Steve, anything to add before I move on to the next question?
No, I think you covered it. I think you covered it. Thank you.
Great. So let's see, what else do we have here? So here's a question that looks like it's for you, Steve. You went over the new integration that you have as part of your announcement for Google Call extensions, where you're accessing and manipulating Google Call extensions from within the Dialog Tech dashboard. How does that compare to or expand the analytics and the functionality that Google already provides natively in AdWords and in Google Analytics? I know they do some basic functionality like call duration and metadata, but what are you doing above and beyond what Google already offers?
Right. So Google does provide some very basic information. Counts of calls and duration is really the extent of it, and they will, as Google does with most things, they abstract and aggregate that data to a total level, not at the user level. So what we're able to do is, when we can determine with 100% accuracy for a specific caller the keyword that they generated, we can make those associations. If we can't determine it with 100% accuracy, we will provide the list of keywords that could have generated that phone call. So we'll provide more detail at the user level about that caller. We'll also provide a series of information, some of which we touched on, around the session. What drove them there, if they go to your landing page, how they navigated through your website, the things they did before and after calling, and then everything that happened on that phone call. Where was it routed? Which agent took it? What happened on the call? Keywords and phrases, etc. So there's really a lot of rich data that marketers can then use above and beyond what they get in AdWords.
And there's what you mentioned earlier, which is not provided in Google, which is, or in most cases, the ability to have that additional option of listening to the call.
Sure, absolutely.
So here's another question. Do you have any data on the completion rate of click-to-call measure the number of people who hit the call button and then hang up before the call is connected? So I don't know if you have that data, Steve, but one thing that I know that you guys do is that you will measure calls in ways that don't. It allows people to see when that happens, so they can separate the good calls from the bad. Even though someone did click on that link, if they hung up, obviously that's something that they want to know about. So do you have a data on the completion rate or anything else to say about how you report that?
Yeah, I don't know the exact percentage of people that hit that button and then cancel out. But yeah, as you suggested, Mike, I mean, we give a lot of metadata around the calls, and if they're short duration, which our customers will specify what they consider to be worthy of analysis, so you can just weed those out of your data sets. So if it's under 5 seconds or it's even under a minute, if you just want to prevent that from being pushed into your web analytics or your CRM or whatever, then that's how our customers typically handle that scenario.
Nice. So we have a few minutes here. I want to squeeze in the last few questions. This person's asking, I've read about a few firms in the space who claim to be able to provide call tracking technology that does not require changing the phone number in a mobile application or mobile web. And I think this alludes to, for years, tracking metered numbers were given in a lot of contexts in order to measure what's happening. Are you allowing people to, or integrating your technology to people's existing campaigns and phone numbers so they don't have to actually change that?
Sure. I mean, any phone number can be ported into our system to be used as part of our platform, so we don't require our customers to change their phone number if they don't want to. Part of the tracking capability, it also depends on how granular you want to get. So a lot of customers will start with what we call a one-to-one relationship, one phone number for one thing, whether it's your website or paid search or whatever, to start getting data to understand at that top level what's working. If you want to go down a few different layers, in the example of paid search, to understand which keywords you're using, that's where our dynamic number insertion technology is used, which does use multiple different phone numbers in pools to get that next layer of data. So, long-winded way of saying it depends on how much information you need to track.
Nice. So here's a question. You mentioned a lot of the attributes of different kind of business categories and verticals that have the most to gain from call analytics. Things like the complexity and the considered purchase and all that good stuff. Vertically speaking, where do you see kind of the most growth or the most trending, either with those attributes in mind or in verticals where, they might possess those attributes, but it hasn't penetrated extensively? So where do you believe there are the most kind of growth opportunities that you guys are addressing?
Sure. So the classic industries, or the traditional industries, if you will, that have always valued phone calls are those that we talked about. The considered purchases. It's infrequent. It's complex. It's expensive. There's some level of urgency there. So that's the insurance and the auto, home services, anything that involves letting another person inside your house for a construction project or pest control or whatever the case may be. Those industries have always valued phone calls because that dynamic has been around for a while. Where we actually see a lot of the growth is everything else, and that's really driven by the mobile story. Marketers across every industry are now paying attention to the phone call again because phone calls mean revenue. So it's sort of the unlikely suspects, if you will, that are now adopting call analytics and automation because of those dynamics.
That's great. So one last question I want to ask you to end on kind of an actionable note, as we're trying to stick with this theme of having concrete and tangible takeaways. So for the audience members who haven't yet adopted call analytics, or maybe in early stages, but are joining us today because they're curious, what are the first steps to really kind of get moving? What can they do today or tomorrow even to kind of begin that process?
Sure. So there's a couple of ways, and it can seem daunting. There's so much here. How do you sort of tackle it all? And where we see most of our customers start is with the attribution piece. So first and foremost, start tracking calls so that you understand the picture of the impact of your marketing. And Google Call extensions, if you're doing paid search, can be a really great way to start because it's so easy to set up and configure and start collecting data. So we usually see our customers dip their toe in that way, and then as they start learning and amassing data that can be used for other purposes, you can kind of explore some of the other elements. So that's how I'd suggest getting a start.
That's well said and a good way to end it. So thank you, Steve. At this point, I'll pass it back to you, Patrick, for final notes and housekeeping.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it. Everyone else is logging out. We'd just like to remind you again that we are sending you an email with a link to the on-demand webinar as well as a PDF of the slides. So keep a lookout from us from that probably tomorrow morning. So if you have any other questions, like I said, you can email us at webinars@BIAKelsey.com. And other than that, I hope you have a great day. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate it. Bye.
Yeah.